Hi, this is Comptroller Brooke Learman welcoming you to the Maryland Association of Counties Conduit Street Podcast, the show that discusses the issues and ideas shaping Maryland policy and politics today.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, how are you? We're quickly approaching Thanksgiving, and that means that session, of course, is right around the corner. Seems like a condensed window.
Yeah, it does feel that way. I mean, I don't know. It used to be folks who would ask, what do you legislative people do the other 9 months of the year? And now it's like the answer is, oh my gosh, it never seems to stop. The legislative environment is a 12-month deal, and once the weather gets cold, it's almost game on. So.
Very good. It is game on for sure. And today we are glad to have a return guest with us to talk through what's going on across Maryland. Todd Eberly is professor of political science and public policy at St. Mary's College of Maryland. Professor, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast and giving us the pulse of Maryland.
Sure. My pleasure. It's great to be back. I think it's actually been about 4 years since I joined you last. So hopefully I do okay this time and can come back again before the 2030s.
The whole nother world out there now, right?
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly things can change.
All true. We're delighted to have you back, and I will tell you, like, setting the stage a little bit for our audience, I remain a social media guy. I know that's maybe a controversial position, and some people are weaning themselves off of Twitter and the other things, that sort of stuff. But I see you sort of flit in and out of the topics that I'm interested in fairly often. So we seem to hang out at a lot of the same places online and on social media. So the general beat here on this podcast. We try and, nominally it's the county government podcast, and that's what MACO represents, but we've landed in sort of a lane where we talk about policy and politics in Maryland generally. And when I reached out, you confirmed you got some things on your mind. So really glad to have you come back and join us.
Great. Yeah, as I said, I'm happy to be here. My primary focus tends to be American politics. I found my way into Maryland politics because I worked for the state of Maryland when I was getting my PhD. And then when I came to St. Mary's, there was an opening. They needed somebody to teach state and community. And I thought, well, this is a perfect opening. So I just dove right in. And the truth of the matter is Maryland is especially impacted by decisions being made in Washington. So when there's a lot going on in D.C., we really tend to feel it here. Whether it's the government shutdown impacting federal workers or contractors, of which we have so many, a slowing economy we're seeing the impact on our tax revenue. We've got tariff and trade policies hitting our farmers, just disaster aid impacting folks in Western Maryland, and even issues related to, Medicaid funding that's critical to so many of our counties, especially rural counties in Western Maryland or the Eastern Shore. There's a lot going on that is really very relevant to Maryland and to Maryland counties.
Yes, and Maryland is certainly unique when it comes to repercussions from federal actions. And let's start with, you just went through a whole bunch of things, and I think we're going to get to all of them. But let's start with the things going on with the federal government. And I want to get your perspective because it has to be a lot from the point of view of a professor of political science. My mom is a recently retired teacher of AP American Government, and so I hear from her all the time, her thoughts on what's happening. But from you, from a professor's point of view, what is it like actively trying to teach politics when so many, let's just say, unusual things are happening? It seems like every single week.
Yeah, I think folks don't fully appreciate how much we rely just on sort of norms of practice. The folks who wrote the Constitution very famously wrote in the Federalist Papers that really, the Constitution is little more than parchment barriers, rules that have been written down on pieces of paper. It requires human beings and human action to sort of respect them and abide by longstanding norms. And when some of those norms start to go out the window, a little bit of chaos ensues. It means that it's always an interesting time to be teaching American politics. But I got to tell you, there are times I sort of yearn for it to be a little bit more boring. And I wonder if by the time I decide to retire, things will get boring again. I don't know if that's something I should wish for or not.
I think that's what is it? The infamous curse, right? May you live in interesting times, right? We certainly are amidst them, and it seems like you ticked off several things right off the bat that make a good menu of topics to get into. I mean, maybe the federal shutdown, if you have like one layer deeper on that front. We've been out talking with our county governing bodies and so forth. And a lot of that conversation is, well, federal employees usually get retroactive pay. So they've got some hardship when you don't get a paycheck, which might last for 2, 4, 5 weeks, this go around. But then you sort of get made whole at the end. And that was part of the resolution to make sure that happened. But if you're a contractor, or if you just, you're selling people pizza right off the military installation in St. Mary's County, no one's coming back to give you the back pay for the 5, 6 weeks that you were shut down. So we'll feel all that sort of stuff. You have any other sort of either practical or political thoughts about government shutdown and what it means short term around here?
I think that's exactly right. It's not just the federal workers. It's the way in which they feed into the larger economy, whether it's money they're spending at the local Target or local restaurants. It's the people selling these folks lunch every day. And then it's also sort of the psychological hit. You've gone a period of time without pay. Do you feel secure sort of re-engaging in your normal spending, or do you try to sort of dial it back and save for a rainy day? Anytime you dial back that spending, you're going to feel that like a multiplier effect through the entire economy. And as I know we'll talk about a little bit later, Maryland is facing some pretty serious budget challenges, and much of that stems from economic activity and from tax revenue. So it's not enough just to think about those folks who didn't get paid, who will be made whole. It's all of those other folks who rely on the flow of that money, who can't be made whole.
Right. I think that's a perspective that Marylanders need to keep in mind, and sort of our fiscal leaders need to keep in mind. And it is having its own effects locally already. So one other topic that you mentioned that I can't help but take the bait on is tariffs. And we've seen the current president, his administration, sort of use tariffs, maybe actual tariffs, and also the mention or threat of possible tariffs as basically a centerpiece of economic policy and foreign policy too. So you have thoughts about tariffs themselves and what that mean, what they may mean back home here in Maryland, or for Maryland, whatever, farmers or manufacturers and so forth. This is complicated economic stuff, a little more nuanced than our president might suggest.
Yeah, it's funny. In my sort of core public policy class, I've taught about the history of tariffs in the United States, and the fact that if you go back to the turn of the 1900s, it was our primary source of federal revenue. And the point I used to make was it was a horrible source of revenue. Tariffs are not a good way to finance a government. It didn't bring in a terrible amount of money. Now, granted, back in the 1900s, the federal government didn't do a lot, but it also led to a whole host of other challenges because, of course, when you impose tariffs on goods that are coming into your country, the countries that are impacted by that impose tariffs on your exports, and they naturally escalate into trade wars. And there's a reason why so much of the 20th century, especially the latter half, was dedicated to economic democracies finding ways to eliminate barriers to trade, because ultimately it wasn't good for domestic economies. It wasn't good for the interconnectedness of markets. And then now we find ourselves in the early part of the 21st century engaging in battles that seemingly had been settled nearly 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And Todd, I mean, I know obviously we have the Port of Baltimore here in Maryland. Obviously, when you have escalating trade wars or races to the bottom, if you will, that's going to affect the entire nation, but certainly a port city like Baltimore. And it also has an effect in rural areas. Can you talk a little bit about that too?
Without question. I mean, we can zero in on just even one aspect of that, and that would be the issues we're having with soybeans and our soybean exports. Maryland soybean farmers are concentrated in the upper and mid-shore counties like Caroline, Kent, Queen Anne's, as well as central Maryland, Frederick and Carroll counties. Caroline County has the highest number of farms, followed closely by Carroll and Queen Anne's. And there's a significant number of soybean farmers there. And from what I'm seeing, soybean farmers are saying that they're facing the worst stress they've seen since the 1980s. I believe the Maryland Soybean Board said there are nearly 13,000 families involved in soybean farming in the state, 16 billion bushels each year, and it's roughly $200 million to the state economy. Right. And our exports to China are expected to be the lowest they've been in nearly 8 years. I mean, that hits at what is already sort of a fragile piece of the market. Most folks who know farmers, and my grandparents were farmers, they often live season to season, year to year. They've got to make enough at the end of the year to pay off the loans that they took to get through that year. So when you have unanticipated hits to that market, it is very difficult for farmers to recover from that.
Yeah, and we know farmers, of course, they're dealing with a lot of different issues, including workforce issues, right? We know that's a challenge as well. But we've seen in Maryland, like the crab industry, anytime you create a shock, especially when it comes to workers and the availability of workers, it has effects across the board. And in Maryland, we've seen that with visas and not being able to get enough people to come and pick crabs, for instance. But now we're seeing it too with a workforce that, a lot of farmers rely on folks that may be getting tied up or scared to go outside because of some of the activity that's happening with federal immigration enforcement. So I know they're feeling that stress too. I want to get to another issue that's close to home, FEMA, or it used to be FEMA. I'm not sure what FEMA is anymore, but this is the Federal Agency for Emergency Response. It has taken a pass on helping Western Maryland after terrible flooding, even though it met all the metrics to get federal aid, and that's been discussed and appealed, and it seems like the federal government is still not going to come through. This does feel like a big shift in federalism, the relationship between the federal government and especially smaller states and local governments. That has to be concerning for you, again, as a professor of political science and watching this all of unfold. But again, this is one where we feel the real world impacts of these policies at the federal level.
Sure. And I mean, I may be living down here in Southern Maryland right now, but I grew up just above state line, Pennsylvania, a stone's throw away from Hagerstown. So what happens in Allegheny and Garrett counties, I mean, that's my backyard. That's near where my folks, my family still live. And after the flooding, I mean, those communities have been left without federal disaster aid, despite the fact that they clearly exceed the qualifying threshold to get assistance. I think the damages were estimated at being well in excess of $33 million. Mm-hmm. The state has been able to provide, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of about $500,000 in aid. So that mathematically is like 1/60th of the damage. So it's going to be state and local governments that are going to face that burden to try to rebuild the infrastructure for residents and businesses. And it's hard to not feel that this is part of sort of a larger political fight that's taking place, because, of course, Maryland is a blue state. Our governor has had some back and forth with the administration, with the president. But this happens to be parts of the state of Maryland that voted overwhelmingly for President Trump. So these are his voters who, in their time of need, are finding the federal government and the agency that's supposed to be there in times of disaster and need, saying, no, we're not going to step in and help you. And I've got to imagine that has to be heartbreaking.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when we were out visiting with the county commissioners in Allegheny County, and I think that the heaviest effects of the storms out in Western Maryland were in this town of Westernport, which is like the prototypical tiny town. There's no wherewithal for the town of Westernport or Allegheny County, for that matter, to come up with the kind of resources that you'll need to rebuild infrastructure and like entire foundations of major roadways that just got ripped apart through the. I mean, it's the classic case for why you have federal support in those kind of circumstances, that there's no way this town or this little region can solve the problem. And even if the state of Maryland theoretically could, is that really the right way to treat an American crisis and say, well, this is your backyard, not mine? It's kind of a worrisome trend, I think. And I say that as a Maryland guy wanting the folks in Maryland to get their justice, but I'm also worried about Western North Carolina or the next Oklahoma, twister and so forth. So I don't know. It's a worrisome trend, I think, on that front, if you're a believer that the feds have a role to play.
Well, I mean, just even think about it from this perspective. One of the things that differentiates states from the federal government is that states have to balance their budget. They can't run deficits. They can't accumulate debt. The federal government can. And obviously, that's a point of contention. On a completely separate show, we could talk about the accumulating federal debt. But the point, of course, is the federal government can, in times of crisis, go into debt, which means they are uniquely able to help in times of crisis and in disaster in ways that local governments absolutely cannot, but that even state governments would be hard pressed to do because of the fact that at the end of the year, they've got to have their books balanced.
So that's sort of a segue into the other big federal topic that we've spent time on this calendar year, and I don't know, this calendar year has felt like a bit of a mystery train, as there's twists and turns almost every couple of weeks. But back in the middle of the summer, when the state was going through, the federal government was going through its full budget reconciliation with the so-called one big beautiful bill, and the federal legislature trying to figure out what they can get through consensus and whatnot. And by the end of that process, it felt like the omnibus bill that they end up passing. The state legislature can't do that, but Congress can pass one giant bill, do tons of stuff, and as long as the Senate parliamentarian says it's part of reconciliation, then they can do a simple majority. So you end up with lots of stuff piled into one big bill, but it's changes in tax policy, but also a lot of things back to that question of what's the role of the federal government on behalf of Americans in general. So, tax cuts being extended or created, but then sort of a framework for what look like a lot of reductions in safety net services, in food support and healthcare for folks of lower income. Sort of a wide range of things that are looming under the surface as well, haven't gotten quite as much attention as SNAP or as Medicaid. You have thoughts about that big picture sort of stuff? I mean, in your line of work, you almost have to, right?
Sure. I mean, you had very briefly mentioned, what had happened with SNAP during the government shutdown. I mean, folks need to understand that the people who are buying their groceries with SNAP, that money is supporting local businesses, it's supporting local farmers. So, I mean, that's a real impact. But I think the changes to Medicaid and Medicaid funding is also sort of critically important. And again, it comes back to there are certain counties in Maryland that have much higher shares of their population that receive their health care through Medicaid. I think there are just a small handful. Again, if we go over to Western Maryland, to Allegheny, or we go over to the Eastern Shore in Dorchester, Somerset, Wacomico, you're looking at nearly 40% of the kids over there get their health care through Medicaid. It goes beyond just the provision of health care to those kids. It's what keeps local healthcare providers in business. They need that revenue source of an otherwise potentially uninsured population. And then it's those healthcare providers and all of the folks that they employ who then go out into the local economy and spend money. So I think that sometimes folks get caught up on sort of the top line number, the top line program like SNAP or like Medicaid, but they don't think about the way in which that money filters through a state's economy, but especially filters through local economies. And because of the nature of safety net programs, they especially help either, suburban parts of really urban parts of inner cities, but especially the most rural parts of states where it's harder to find work and it's especially hard to find providers. And often you'll have, food deserts, not a good variety of grocery stores. It's that source of funding that keeps those businesses operating in those areas.
I think that's an interesting way to think about it. And certainly I don't think a lot of folks are thinking of it that way. It seems everything is politicized. now when you're either team red or team blue. And before we kind of shift to, what's going on in Maryland and our budget situation, just what is it? What is the tenor right now? Like, what's the tenor? How are kids feeling? Is there apathy? Is there disdain for the government? How do you keep the train on the tracks? How do you keep kids interested and wanting to get into this field when it seems like everything is on fire?
Yeah, it's really strange. I was thinking about this and actually talking to some folks the other day. When I think about the age of the students I have, they came of age sort of during this much more clearly divided everything team red, team blue world, and also in a world where what many of us grew up seeing as norms sort of have been pushed to the side. So what to us seems unusual or abnormal, to them is the only normal they've ever known. So it does present a challenge to try to give folks an historic context to say, well, this is not the way things always were. There was a time when Republicans and Democrats would actually work together for shared interest, and that we produced some pretty impressive accomplishments in the past in bipartisan ways. When I give examples of things that passed with bipartisan majorities or where the parties work together, students are often just sort of amazed or sort of laugh at the thought of the two parties working
Right.
cooperatively, because it's just not the world they know.
Right. Sad but true. What a world that we live in. But obviously, it has to be interesting. And I mean, obviously, you've done this for a long time, and you've been through the ebbs and flows and seen how your students react. But this has got to be just, and I like that. But I hadn't thought about that. Is that, well, really, this has been their reality since the time they were born. So that is interesting too. But since we are a Maryland-focused show, we focus on state and local government. Let's talk a little bit about the situation here in Maryland, the state budget. We know we just got some bad news in the last few weeks. It looks like choppy waters ahead once again. It seems like this is the norm this time of year, right? We get this bad news and everybody needs to buckle down, and no one knows how we're going to get out of it. But from your point of view, what do you see there? We know there are a lot of factors playing into this, but how do you view this sort of at a macro level in terms of what's happening and why we are where we are?
I mean, look, it is a serious challenge. The most recent estimates are, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of a $1.4 billion budget shortfall for the coming fiscal year. The last estimate had been somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 million. I don't teach math, but 300 million versus 1.4 billion is a pretty substantial change in our economic forecast. And Maryland, as I had said a little while ago, we've got to balance our books. So how in the world do we close a shortfall like that? We know some of this is being driven by economic uncertainty. The U.S. economy is not as strong as it could be. We've got a very uneven job market. Certainly, as we touched on earlier, tariff and trade policy is adding to that. Stability of the federal workforce is adding to it. The costs of the blueprint for education continue to be a challenge for us moving forward. And then you add to that the fact that we're coming into an election year in Maryland, and that always puts extra stress on legislators as they're focused on the next election cycle. And you need to make really tough decisions about, well, how are we going to balance the books? Are we going to cut programs that are popular? Are we going to try to find new ways to raise revenue after we just did that in a recent session? There's a reason why I don't envy the folks who have to make these decisions.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like you mentioned election year. We've already heard leaders talk about, any kind of raising revenue is off the table for the 2026 session. So in that environment, it seems the only way would be to cut, right? And in an environment where we're losing federal services and support, it seems pretty tough to make cuts. You'd want to add money, right, to try and backfill what we're losing, but we can't do that. So I think that adds to the challenge, right?
If you look at Maryland's budget pie, I mean, what are the big slices? The big slices are health and education. And it's almost never popular to make cuts to education. When you do that, you often wind up shifting those burdens off to the counties and to local governments to try to make up for it. Trying to make cuts to funding for healthcare programs. A lot of that money is matched by federal dollars. So whatever you cut, you don't actually save as much as you thought you would. because you could jeopardize incoming federal matching dollars. But at the same time, if the economy is weakening, that's exactly when folks need some of the safety net money that could be coming in.
Yeah, like they sometimes say, the business of government is counter-cyclical. That
Yes.
right when revenues start to dry up because the economy is soft, that's exactly when people look to the public sector to say, well, maybe this is where I can go and get some backup health care because I've lost coverage through my old job or other things like that. The lines are longer at the health clinic right when we can least afford it, as a matter of local revenue. It's one of the built-in challenges of public sector service. I, I just think the situation we're in is tricky. You have to mention the political dynamic of it being an election year, and Maryland, in our collective wisdom, we have a giant, big election year. It's the entire state legislature are on 4-year terms. The governor and the other statewide elected officials are on the same 4-year terms. And with the exception of Baltimore City and a couple of the seats in Cecil County, all the county government leaders are on the same 4-year cycle. That's by design, but it also creates an awful lot of it's really tough to do big things when you're up against it in an election year. It's, just as a matter of candor, this coming year's budgets will be challenged that way. I think legislative leaders at the state level wanted to make a 2-year plan last year to get through not just FY26 that we're in, but also to sort of be able to coast through FY27, get past the election, and if we have lingering shortfalls in the forecast, sort of deal with them in the next term. And it looks like we may not be afforded that luxury just because some acceleration of federal issues and some slowdown in the economy and these multiple things sort of, compounding to turn, what do we say, a 300 million into $1.4 billion? Yeah, that's a pretty big delta, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you actually mentioned the fact that in Maryland it's pretty much all this 4-year cycle. In my Maryland politics class, I talked to my students about how sort of odd a design that is. One of the reasons why we have the staggered terms that we see at the federal level is because we wanted to have a system where not everybody was driven by the exact same election cycle, because it gives you the freedom to in some cases think long term, think beyond the next election, to make difficult decisions where you might not pay a political price for it immediately, and maybe there'd be time for the public to see the potential benefits of the decisions you make. But here, every member of the assembly, be they in the House or in the Senate, the exact same 4 years. Governor, exact same 4 years. They are all stuck in that exact same election cycle, and they all see it staring at them as they're going into this coming session.
Right.
Absolutely, no doubt about that. Todd, I wanted to pick your brain on one other topic before we wrap up. I want to talk housing a little bit. It's always good to get outside perspectives. I mean, we talk a lot about housing. We talk a lot with stakeholders about housing. Obviously, it's a huge issue across the country. Affordability is. And so when you look at this issue, I mean, what do you see as the major factors? I mean, we often hear about zoning and we get it, and we're taking steps. I think that's a piece of it, but it's not the whole pie. So when you look at this housing crisis and you look at back where we were maybe, when everything hit the fan in 08, 09, with that housing bubble, we're trying to avoid getting back to that. But what can we do in your mind to get more housing units online that are affordable and available for the workforce and for folks who are just starting out?
Yeah, that's a great question. My father actually, before he retired, that's what he did. He was a home builder. And I remember what he always says is you can always check the health of the economy by the housing market. And I think I would do him a disservice if I didn't make a case for what we need to be focusing on is workforce and affordable housing. We have made this transition towards very large homes, single family homes, as opposed to, say, duplexes. We've made it difficult to build smaller homes and homes in more concentrated areas where you can, fit far more homes into a smaller area. You've got a lot of folks who are worried that if you open an area up to more development, it'll diminish the value of their own homes. So you've got that sort of not in my backyard problem. But I think that there needs to be a restored focus on workforce housing. And that does mean smaller units. I think it means accepting that things such as duplexes or multi-unit housing is okay. But I also think that we've got the challenge right now of interest rates making it unattractive to folks to even take out the loans to buy homes, which means it's become a challenge right now to sell even existing homes. So you've got a lot of factors that are working against that right now. We're dealing with it down here in St. Mary's County. A lot of folks sort of think of it as a rural area, but we've got Pax River Naval Base down here, which actually brings a lot of sort of high-paying jobs to the area and drives up the price of housing and the demand for housing.
Right.
Makes it very hard to attract folks to just good middle-class paying jobs, let alone entry-level jobs, and to be able to find an affordable place to live and raise a family.
Right. And I think adding to that, right, when you want to create more density and more units, you need the infrastructure, right? And when the state is in a position where it can't really invest, I mean, as we know, all things are connected. So without the pipes and without the schools and the fire department, it's hard to create that density without the infrastructure, right? And so I think that adds to it as well.
Well, it absolutely does. I mean, it's as you mentioned, we're actually going through a round of school district redistricting in St. Mary's right now. And it comes down to there are certain areas that are growing, and those are the areas that have the infrastructure to support it. And there are certain areas that simply are not or are shrinking because they're on septic, there's no public water, and they're trying to rebalance the schools. And you folks, I'm sure, know as well as anybody, you want to delve into some controversy.
Yeah.
Forget congressional redistricting. Talk about the redrawing of district lines for your schools. Yeah. Suddenly, everybody in the community is showing up at those meetings.
Yes.
Katie barred the door there. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But all of those moving pieces are part of it. Right. And you know, we had it's been a while, but we had the county executive from Anne Arundel County talking about he was trying to collaborate with the school system to say, let's do some redistricting and reallocate so that we can create space in the schools so we don't have these sort of, you know, decades old smart growth measures, like grow where you've got the infrastructure, where you have the pipes and where you have the roads and where you have the seats in the schools. But if the schools end up misaligned to today's population, you need to do some reorganizing there. But the county government doesn't get to do that. He can bully pulpit a little bit of that and try and encourage the school systems to do that. But in Maryland, they're an independent entity, and for good reason. But that's it's part of that larger puzzle for sure.
Well, I think there's also the challenge of all of these counties want to attract business. And frequently there are areas that you would like to see reinvestment, but often that's not where the businesses want to go. And you find yourself in this situation of you desperately want the businesses to come into your county, into your local area, but you can't really impose on them the requirement, okay, you're going to come in, but we've got this abandoned storefront in this neighborhood that we'd really like to revitalize. We want you to go there. And they're going to say, no, we want to go over to this, main road where the lights and the infrastructure and everything is existing. That's where the customers are going to go to. So you find yourself in that very difficult situation that only adds to real congestion in some areas where you've got other areas that you're just desperate to redevelop, but you don't necessarily have the power to do it.
Yeah, very, very well put. And that connects to so many different issues that are before our county leaders and also before our state legislative leaders for this coming session. The election year, the 2026 legislative session will be hot, but just like these are the challenges. The easy stuff's already been solved. It's the tough stuff that you have to work out. And that's a really good framing of why some of this stuff remains difficult and elusive. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, if it was easy to solve, we would have solved it. And that is a refrain I use so many times when I'm teaching public policy. There's a reason why some of these issues continue to be problems. It's because there isn't an easy solution.
No doubt about it. And Professor Eberly, we really enjoy talking to you. I'm sorry it's been 4 years. We're going to make it so it's not that long next time. But I want to leave you with the closing thought. Anything we haven't gotten into, anything you want to get off of your mind for our audience, I'll give you the closing thought.
All I'd say is everybody these days, national politics has sucked all of the oxygen out of the room. But for the things that impact our day-to-day lives, it is state and local government that has the biggest impact. And I think there is a need for folks to sort of step back from the national polarization and refocus on state and local governance if they really want to have an impact on the issues that matter to them.
I think we'd agree with that very much. Michael, anything you want to say before we let everybody go?
That's a perfect way to land the plane. I love it.
All right. Well, thank you again, Professor Eberly. We will link his social media accounts so that you can follow him and read all of his musings and content. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, the Conduit Street blog. But for Professor Todd Eberly, Michael Sanderson, and our esteemed producer, Chantel Malcolm Lim, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.